Dan Watkins. He is an assistant professor of history at Baylor University and works on the history of Catholicism in 18th century France. He is the author of Berruyer's Bible, Public Opinion, and the Politics of Enlightenment Catholicism in France. For today, though, he's going to speak about the impact of digital humanities scholarship on the Enlightenment.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Yeah, that's a tough act to follow.
Yeah.
She did that to me. I'm going to do my best here to be kind of quick, and some of the things that I'm going to talk about actually are going to kind of overlap quite well with some of the things that have come up. What Nita said with some of the other people have said too. When approached to talk about new directions in the study of 18th century France, my mind immediately went to digital humanities scholarship. I'm admittedly a neophyte in this. I'm just now dipping my toes into a new project that would utilize DH techniques and tools, so I'm beginning to process what's out there. Thus, I wanted to use this opportunity to do a brief sort of analysis, a historiographic analysis in a way, of looking at what DH work has contributed to our understanding of the Enlightenment. And before I go any further, I want to give a quick shout out to Megan Roberts, who unfortunately isn't here. She's the co-organizer with me of our Enlightenment workshop. She and I led a discussion somewhat recently of a publication that came out just a few years ago, Digitizing Enlightenment, edited by Simon Burrows and Glenn Rowe, from which I'll be pulling today, and that conversation is really informative for me, so shout out to Megan if you're watching. She's probably not, but. So for the few minutes I have, I want to do three things. The first is I want to define what we mean by the digital humanities, because I think that's important. Second, I want to discuss some of the ways that DH methodologies have been applied to study the Enlightenment and what we've learned from those. And then finally, I want to think about both the promise and the perils of digital methods. But let's begin with definitions. The digital humanities is no more than scholarship that employs computational analysis to explore and better understand the realm of human activity. As Johanna Drucker has described, it's simply the intersection of computational methods and humanities materials. By this definition, most, if not all of us, have engaged in digital humanities scholarship. If you've utilized a database of a particular digital collection to identify sources on a topic or theme, well, congratulations, you have used computational methods in order to process humanities materials. Good on you, you are now a DH scholar. There are, in my mind, however, two main dimensions of this work. The first is what we might call the generative side of DH, and the second is the analytical side. What I mean here by generative is the construction of data sets and tools to analyze those data sets. This includes everything from digitization to transcription projects and the creation of websites, software, algorithms that allow computers to read and process data efficiently and toward a precise factual end. The second is what scholars then do with those tools and data sets. Text data mining, topic modeling, network analyses, text reuse analysis, data visualizations and data mapping, they all stand as examples of this kind of work at the second end. So what's important to note here, what I think is one of my main points I want to make, is that both sides of this work are interpretive. The location and construction of data is as much an interpretive act as the analysis and explanation of that data. We choose what computers analyze and how they analyze it. So DH scholarship has been present in the world of French history for quite a long time. I'm sure you all know this, since arguably all the way back to the Annales and the Cliometrics movement of the 70s and 80s. But it's really grown exponentially in the last 20 years or so. Much of this new wave of digital humanities scholarship on the Enlightenment has come from major digitization projects, like the Artful Project, which is probably one that everyone knows, which since its inception in 1982 has digitized some 3,000 texts in their free text corpus. And more recently, the Electronic Enlightenment project out of the University of Oxford, which includes some 79,000 letters as of spring 2022. These projects, and a number of others, including the French book trade in Enlightenment Europe, the one that Burroughs is at the center of, have provided scholars with materials that they've used to explore the Enlightenment via new digital tools. These have been the main bases of data that lots of these projects have used. What these projects have added to our understanding, or what have rhetorical question there, Dan. What have these projects added to our understanding of the Enlightenment? Well, frankly, this question is way too big for me to answer in the 6 minutes I have left. But I want to just spotlight a few examples of projects that have reaffirmed and challenged pre-existing scholarship on the Enlightenment. The first one I want to look at is Melanie Conroy and Chloe Summers Edmondson's Salon project, part of the larger Mapping the Republic of Letters project out of Stanford University. It's done much to uncover the social networks of Parisian salons, swimming sort of amidst the seemingly opposing currents of salon historiography, one that sort of emphasizes the fundamentally philosophical nature, and the other that emphasizes their role as an institution in sort of old regime court sociability. Conroy and Edmondson provide quantitative data to reveal that salons were socially mixed institutions, not necessarily including members of the court to a high degree, but also not purely spaces for just intellectual radicals. Perhaps most interestingly, however, Conroy and Edmondson found significant change over time. Over the course of the 18th century, salons included more and more members of the academies, more contributors to the Encyclopédie, and more figures who had corresponded with the major philosophers of the era. Salons became increasingly philosophical, in other words, as Conroy and Edmondson described. This is a unique intervention into what was already a robust historiographic debate in salons. DH scholarship has also been employed in more openly revisionist directions. Simon Burroughs' work with the archival records of the Société typographique de Neuchâtel has focused on answering the question of what French people read before the Revolution, and revealed that the illicit sort of pornographic books that Robert Darnton has made such notable use of throughout his career were one dimension of the output of this famous publisher, but certainly not the only one, and not even really the main type in many ways. Indeed, by analyzing thousands of publisher records, Burroughs has made a compelling case that in some regions of France, like the Francophone, religious books were still the predominant literary genre among the reading public. Clovis Gladstone, Dan Edelstein, Robert Morrissey have similarly used the artful database and 18th century collections online database to investigate literary influences on Enlightenment texts. In their article, to quote or not to quote in the Journal of the History of Ideas, they definitively showed using text-for-use analysis that the encyclopedists were committed to a broad strategy of both citation and plagiarism, as Jeff mentioned earlier. Something that Enlightenment historians knew anecdotally, but that was confirmed in depth by this trio of digital humanists, writing sort of quantitatively so. Gladstone, moreover, has applied the text-for-use analysis further to the Echo collection to look at which works were most often cited in this largely English language data set, and came out with a fascinating discovery that over half of text-for-use incidents that he tracked, 58.5%, came from one particular source. This is what I would do if I were teaching. I would say, what source do you think that is? I'll give it to you. It was the Bible. Right? However much secularization was taking hold of Enlightenment in Europe, this study reminds us that religion remained a significant part of European cultural life well into the Revolutionary era. So these are all important contributions to our understanding of the Enlightenment. And the examples I've provided here only scratch the surface of the work that DH scholars have done. I want to end this brief introduction with an assessment of the possibilities of what computational analysis can do going forward, and offer some warnings about ways that this work can have unintended and sometimes counterproductive consequences if we're not careful. Regarding possibilities, what digital humanities scholarship is perhaps best at is providing scope. Though it will never replace close reading as a technique of analysis integral to the work of historians, the distant reading provided by computational analysis can help us look at cultural productions on a grander scale. And here, I just want to encourage everyone to look at Elizabeth Bond's book on the affiche, the Writing Public Participatory Knowledge Production in Enlightenment and Revolutionary France, for an example of how DH work can lead to fascinating analyses of large swaths of readers and writers and the ways that they shaped intellectual debates. More of this will be possible as more and more data sets emerge, and as Simon Burroughs and Glenn Rowe have called for, as these data sets start to get linked together in constructive ways, which is a really important thing that needs to happen. Yet I want to revisit our definition of digital humanities for a moment in order to close with a warning for potential practitioners of DH scholarship. Let's remember that DH work is generative and analytical, and that both functions depend upon human involvement and human interpretation. This is important because the studies that come from computational analysis are only as good as the materials that we feed into the computer. And the fact of the matter is that much of the data that digital historians of the Enlightenment have fed into the computers has been data from a very specific and closed group of intellectual elites. This is understandable in a sense because the writings of Voltaire, the letters of philosophers are easily accessible and frankly, more easily transformed into machine-readable text. The danger of relying on these texts, however, is that it can reify a construct of the Enlightenment as inherently elitist, something that much of the historiography of the past few decades, including the work of Bond, Jeremy Cardona, Paola Bertucci, many of the fellow panelists here, many of you out in the audience, over the past few decades have been pushing back against. And as Michel Rolfe-Trouillot has taught us, the easiest available sources can often propagate the silencing of voices of the past, the erasure of the words and deeds and stories of so many people whose actions and ideas also influenced the cultural and intellectual currents of their time. But changing the generative side of DH work, I believe, can help shift that conversation, shift the conversation on the interpretive side of DH. Doing more to digitize documents from non-hegemonic sources, to build platforms for research and exploration that look beyond elite intellectual circles, will open up promising new angles to view 18th century French culture. For if we think of the Enlightenment, as Dorinda Dutram has described, as a series of debates engaging a wide variety of people and places, then we should try to find ways to bring as many of those people, as many of those places, as many of those conversations in as possible. The benefits of digital humanities scholarship is that once the data is available, computational analysis can provide us with tools to assess them on a large scale. But the more data, the better.
All of our panelists, I am now going to invite them to flip their chairs around, if they would. And the most important part of today is to invite you all to participate in this discussion. We've tried to bring you a variety of viewpoints on the study of the Francophone 18th century, where it's going, where it might go, and we are really interested in hearing your reactions and contributions. So if you would like to engage with our panelists, ask a question, make a comment, I'm gonna be doing talk show, bringing you a microphone because we're recording this dialogue. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and tell us your name, and then we'll just take it away. Let's talk.
I think everybody's in line.
I do know from the conference organizers that there is a snack coming soon.
Okay, to be clear, I'm taking one from the team because this is not a really formal question. So a lot of you were speaking about the Enlightenment as an intellectual movement, and some of you seem to be using Enlightenment as a stand-in for the 18th century. So I just wonder about sort of disaggregating it, because it seems like some of the problems that were being discussed might be more pronounced in the study of the Enlightenment as an intellectual movement than the study of the French 18th century in general, which I think has grown to study people of color and, sexual minorities and women in ways that I don't know. That's I guess my question.
I'm sure others have something to add to that, but I completely agree with that. That's why I kind of focused on the Enlightenment, because I do feel like actually not in all instances, and I'm thinking of how Enlightenment is taught institutionally and where it's being studied. That was part of what I was trying to get at. But it's almost like it's become its own separate branch and almost not engaging with, in fact, a lot of really creative material that's being generated about the 18th century that has really shifted how we look at the 18th century. And I think the why is actually involved in institutional practices.
So I will be the first to say that I would not consider myself an Enlightenment scholar. I come and I participate in the wonderful Dan and Megan led ceremony, but we pray at the altar of Dan. I am really bad about bouncing into the 18th century and the Enlightenment as this kind of similar thing, and they are not. But I guess my kind of point is that both the 18th century and the Enlightenment can do with more Indian Ocean, which is a broken record for anyone who talks to me. But that if we, I don't know where that was going. But and I don't even want to say the Indian Ocean which we get as a very, Masserine or, French India, but like also bring in the French Jesuits in China and Southeast Asia, and all of this very complex, the Pacific Ocean world too in the early 18th century, which has their own. Many French Indian living families send their children back to France to become these well-educated scholars, and there's plenty of people who publish who are born in French India and come back and participate in this Enlightenment kind of thing that we just don't integrate with these kinds of who is part of this Enlightenment. And for all of the scholars, Voltaire and Raynal and all of these people who talk about India or the Indies and these places, we know a lot less about the Indian Ocean world and what kind of construction it makes to like, really understand the Enlightenment more broadly and kind of globally. And that was like a super well from thought. But
Thanks. I'm Ian Kohler from UC Irvine. Thank you, everyone. And sorry, actually, I missed you think this was still going in our other panel. It was just great to hear these really fascinating insights. I want to ask a provocative and kind of self-interested question, which is, so, all of these fabulous opening up of the Enlightenment, the religious Enlightenment, the Catholic Enlightenment, the Protestant Enlightenment, the Jewish Enlightenment, the Muslim Enlightenment, and then, opening this up and making it possible then to think about, it no longer shuts out what is happening in China, what is happening in India, what is happening in Egypt, and so on. But then there's this problem of what does Enlightenment actually mean? And why is this period being privileged? And why are we using Enlightenment as the tent into which we're bringing everything else? And once I was giving a world history class, and I was asking, was the Enlightenment a global experience? And I suddenly thought, well, I should please switch that around. What's the global experience and Enlightenment? And so I'm just, I'm interested, at what point do we let go of the Enlightenment? At what point does the Enlightenment actually, when is it still helping us to understand, or is it actually the barrier that prevents us from understanding things? I said it would be provocative.
I'll say something. The proliferation of enlightenment is like mushrooms. It really is. And I kind of say when I have to address this issue, like why do we approve enlightenment, what's that about, is that the fact that we have generated so many enlightenments suggests something about what that means, is that it is in fact incredibly protein, and that it can in fact take many, many forms. And I think that's one of the things that's really important. And I think that actually in my book I've more frequently used the idea of enlightenment intellectual culture as opposed to just the enlightenment. And I think there is a difference there in terms of the participatory aspect, in terms of people coming in. And also Dan Edelstein wrote something really, really good where he said, one of the signals of enlightenment is that everybody was claiming they were enlightened. Everybody saying, oh, we're living in an era of enlightenment. We're being enlightened, and so that if people are making that claim, I think we have to kind of, well, what are they claiming here? And why are they claiming it? What's in it for them to make that kind of a claim? And so I think that's part of the reason why I think it's still a useful category. But I do think, the utility of a category like that is based on whether or not you can come up with questions. And I think everybody here has, right? And I think that's ultimately the utility of it. It still works out. And I think that everybody who writes a book or an article about enlightenment, they have to engage with this question, and they have to say, this is what I'm talking about. This is what it means. So we're going to have questions. What is enlightenment? Vexed question. I think for a very long time. I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer, but that's my answer.
I can try. I think that's a fantastic question. I really to add beyond that. But one of the issues I think we always encounter with the Enlightenment is the fact that the term itself is a later day invention, right? It's English, I think, by the early 20th century at best. And so, you're always fighting against that anachronism. A lot of my work has been sort of trying to get around that, the constant proliferation. I love that metaphor. I may have to mention that in class, and I'll cite you of the proliferation of the mushrooms and multiple enlightenments. And I suppose one of the obvious answers, and there are plenty of people who've made this point, is that maybe there really isn't that this is something that is retrospectively imposed on a period to explain later things in the 19th century, like industrialization and whatnot. To the other question of seeing it as a synonym for the sum total of social and cultural history in the 18th century, no, I don't think anybody up here would. I certainly wouldn't say that that's the case. And you're right, there can be a, I think this spoke to Misha's point and to Ian's, that there can be a tendency to accidentally ally the Enlightenment to all of it and forget that it's a very particular thing. The social practice of the Enlightenment, I think, is very productive and allows us to, in some sense, globalize it. But now I've wondered that myself. I mean, on a certain level, I think, last point, that the 18th century, perhaps what we think of as the Enlightenment might better be seen as an originally European symptom of some series of processes going along. And here I'm thinking, of course, of Sebastian Conrad and also the work by C.A. Baylor and so forth. So, yes, it can be a barrier, no question about it. But I don't, like April, I think that we shouldn't abandon the category for other sort of utilitarian reasons, because I think something that retrospectively or otherwise we look back at has created many problems, and it's created many, in some ways it's been a germ of liberation in many ways too. And so it's this interesting ambivalent category of historiographical analysis that we have to wrestle with, but there's no good answer to that very excellent question. Even less satisfying answer probably than others.
Christy Kikura, George Mason University. I'm going to take sides in this debate in support of many enlightenments. And this is not surprising for people who know my work, because I wrote one of the many enlightenments, the military enlightenment. I agree with April that and through Dan Elstein's interpretation that Antoine Duty recently sort of brought back into discussion about the Enlightenment as a narrative positioning of certain individuals at the time, and understanding of what they were doing, and understanding of their historical moment, this esprit philosophique, esprit critique. So I think there's a there, and I think that people were doing it in different ways in different spaces. And so I am personally against the notion that a bunch of different enlightenments is a problem, because people may bring that esprit into their own sector and say, well, how am I a part of this enlightened age? And actually, the people who I studied did use the word lumière and illuminer. So in that way, the terminology is definitely what was an 18th century thing. But I think there's also, it's sort of cool to hate the Enlightenment, and it's also cool to hate lots of different enlightenments now. And I think that is also a way of discarding, different non-intellectual history or cultural historical approaches or intellectual histories that are in the classic canon that are looking at different bodies of documents. So I think that we need to be careful about falling too much into condemning multiple enlightenments, because quite simply, there were many. Bang.
Can I add, just quickly, I can scream too. Okay.
It's not on that.
I want to just add to that comment, but then also to what Mita said about, institutionally, the Enlightenment is a buzzword that is like the French Revolution. It's like the World War I. It's something that is going to attach people or attract undergraduates, attract class numbers. Yeah, we're adding more sex, we're adding the Caribbean, we're adding the military, whatever enlightenment we want to create. It still is how we draw people in. It's still this institutional obstacle. How we teach it is something we need to consider, and what voices we do, but
No, it's the opposite. If I have the word enlightenment, I'll get 3 people.
I feel like, and again, this is as a graduate student from Georgetown, what students are interested in when I teach these classes is they're still interested in this idea, which might be we're just an institution. So that could be part of it. But they still seem interested in understanding and coming out of this idea of the kind of thing, which clearly is not hegemonic, I guess, everywhere and is different. But I think that it still resonates with people, with scholars in different fields than in other people about what it is and what they think it is and how to interact with it, what they know from it.
Actually, can I say something really quick?
So I found it actually interesting, especially given that this is the way the conversation has gone, that this panel was actually new voices in the 18th century. And as I listened to everyone else's papers, I was like, was I supposed to contextualize this within the Enlightenment? Which I did not, but that's kind of naturally the way that things went. Going back to this idea of kind of conflating the two, and I think even at some point in my paper I had 18th century France, and I was looking at the audience and said Enlightenment France, right? So we just kind of are conflating the two, but I mean, it makes sense that it goes in that direction.
All right, lots of hands back there. Liana, comment?
Hi, I'm Leanna Vardy from SUNY Buffalo. I just taught the Enlightenment in my history class, and I think it is communicating a language to the students. It's a body of knowledge that they ought to be knowledgeable about. It's a way of perceiving the world. It doesn't mean that there aren't multiple enlightenments. I do tell them that there isn't just the French Enlightenment. They should be aware that there are different kinds. But I think not teaching the Enlightenment is basically harmful in a sense to them. They are not going to know what the rest of us know, and that creates this elitist position where if you're older you know about it, but if you're younger now you will not.
Colin Jones, I'm like Ian, I'm going to be really provocative, but please talk to me after I've said this as well. But I sort of came in expecting new perspectives on France in the 18th century and was surprised. I'm very sorry Angela, I missed you at the beginning of your paper. It seemed to be what's coming out is that really 18th century France means the Enlightenment, and especially given the sort of emphasis of the way people have talked about it, is in teaching and in communicating that. And I just think, well, what is left out? I mean, we're talking about age here with Leanna. I came in when the most important thing about 18th century France was the price of grain. So we've come a long way, and it's not necessarily a bad way or good way, whatever, but it was very different. And it did have the advantage, at least, of thinking about people who actually were not in print, whose work is not digitized, and actually they seem to be completely left out of the picture. And we can multiply the Enlightenments, that's absolutely fine. I'm totally happy about multiplying them. But I'm not sort of getting a big picture about 18th century France. I'm getting more a picture about the way in which the Enlightenment is important and the way in which the 18th century is thought about. And I guess I would just say, is that right? And maybe interrogate that, and is that the right way to go in the future?
I'll try to succinctly address your point, Colin, and maybe sort of circle back if I have time to Christie's for a moment. I think that that's a valid point. Most of my work has been fairly France-specific, to some degree, at least regarding what I contributed today. This was partially historiographic and a little bit more pan-European, even transatlantic sort of approach. And so, I do think that we were making an effort to dance in and out of the intellectual and cultural history of France from different angles and bringing the Indian Ocean, as well as also scholarly practices and institutional settings for how we study and teach these things as Mita did, but without losing entirely the French dimension. My paper is probably the most guilty of that here, but that may just be the particular perspective. But that's a very good question, one I think we're considering. To Christie's point, just very briefly, I'm not utterly against, and I think few of us are, the necessity of occasionally dividing out different sociocultural networks and studying them with an adjective and then enlightenment as a separate enlightenment. theological enlightenment, military enlightenment. We could probably all do the round robin of the various enlightenments in the Caribbean enlightenment. But the interesting thing about looking at the Enlightenment as a subset of the larger intellectual, larger cultural history of the 18th century is it kind of depends on where you're sitting and what point you're trying to make. Retrospectively, you can see how the late Enlightenment in France, in particular, is important to understanding its, Baker and Edelstein's notion of revolutionary scripts, among other things. And I think in some ways you can study the points of origin of something that can be later looked back upon as Enlightenment, which is more a bit what I'm doing, trying to sort of trace how the culture of letters changes from late humanism up through what we might think of as chronologically variously defined as origins. Oftentimes, and I'd like to think I'm a little more elegant about this in print than in when I'm trying to describe it, I think of the separate enlightenments as mushrooms, I guess, but mostly as snapshots, sort of synchronic snapshots of particular moments within different publics and involving different people. But if you want to look at the process by which all of those different groups interact with one another and change one another, I think there's a diachronic dimension that you can try to trace from the retrospective or the forward motion. Depending on how you do that, you end up, I think, coming up with very different approaches to what the Enlightenment is, or even if that's what you're talking about.
Okay, and there's a question now.
I just want to follow up, Colin, I'm going to push you one further, because my own work right now is about, actually a lot like yours, Angela, is about voices that are lost, hidden voices, submerged voices. And that even begs the question, 18th century? Like even our chronological impositions, because we are, historians change over time. I mean, there are a couple of things that are embedded in how we do what we do. We impose narrative, and narrative involves agency. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, so I'll stop. And so tomorrow's part 2, as it were. But also, that even drives those questions. It goes beyond just enlightenment. It's like what we consider to be history. And I think what you show with those patients is actually people pushing back against enlightenment, enlightenment influenced doctors as well. There's this other kind of anti-enlightenment that has nothing to do with the intellectual, but how you experience it. That moment when enlightenment becomes almost physical experience.
Yeah, I just wanted to say briefly, first of all, I talk about France here because I'm at a conference of French historians, and my first kind of intellectual experience and loyalty was with French history. But my book is half about what's going on with the British Caribbean. So there are differences in terms of the kinds of activities that are going on there. But I do take the point. The thing I want to kind of say in response also to Liana is it would be really interesting to do a study of syllabi of the Enlightenment. Because I teach the Enlightenment, and I don't just teach Rousseau. I mean, I love to teach Rousseau, but I don't just teach Rousseau. I also teach Edward Long from his History of Jamaica, which is one of the most profoundly racist texts that I think has probably ever been written. I assign articles about how enlightenment takes shape in other parts of the world, in other parts of Europe. So I do think that the Enlightenment as a rubric, which may or may not attract students, I found that generally my courses do pretty well in it. How we teach it and the courses and the texts that we include in it have probably changed enormously over the last 50 years. But we don't see it because there's the Enlightenment. And so I think that's a really good thing to try to keep in mind too.
So we are now out of time, but this is a good conversation, and we don't have any rush place to go. So if you need to step out, that's great, but if you'd like to stay and talk, let's go.
Thank you, Howard Brown from Binghamton University, SUNY. So let's go back to the 18th century for a second. Was ist der Aufklärung, 1784, Kant, he's asking the question. They're already dealing in the 18th century with what is this? In many respects, his idea is a gerund. It's an activity, it isn't a thing or a body of work, right? It's very personal, and I think we should keep that in mind. I think also Les Lumières embeds already a multiplicity in the understanding, and that's how the French approached it. So they didn't have one movement and one idea and one method. And thirdly, I think we have to recognize that the Enlightenment is one of those signifiers that gives something else more importance. That we keep attaching things to the Enlightenment because it seems to have some significance. It's got resonance, it's important, whatever we can attach to it gets raised in its importance. And in many ways, what we've been doing all along is actually bringing it down. While we attach all these things to the Enlightenment, we've been reducing it to less and less coherence, less and less significance, less and less of what it stood for in the 18th century when people talked about it using the language that we try to use now. So I think we have to keep very much in mind that the Enlightenment, conceptually for us and our students, is a signifier that adds significance, and keep teaching it with that in mind.
Rebecca McCoy, Lebanon Valley College, America. I wanted to comment on what Howard just said and what Liana said about teaching Enlightenment, because I was asked to teach it even though it's really not my specialty at all. And I taught it as part of a 3-course sequence where our sophomores had to take a course in the social sciences, which was history for me, and then science, and then humanities. And so they took a course in psychology on the process of knowing, the cognitive processes. They took one on astronomy and linked that to the scientific revolution. And then my course was on the Enlightenment. And so my course was taught more about what Howard said, it's a method, it's a way of knowing. And I wanted them, like Liana said, to read some of the important texts because most of them had no clue about philosophy or even the political heritage that the American documents came out of. But it was really helpful. They liked the course, and I had a captive audience because these kids had to take this. But they got interested, and what I thought was useful is that we really looked at these texts as, how do these people know this? How are they making their arguments? How are they using first math and then logic to come up with arguments and to use evidence? And I wanted them to link that to how they dealt with that in their liberal arts education. And we did some social history where they did their own projects and presented to the class on the social background, but as how you know things and how you process knowledge and use evidence seem to me in the world we're in right now to be a really useful way of thinking about it, to think of it as a method, not just in terms of certainly introducing them to important texts. And I did do some Latin America and other things as well. Anyway, thank you.
All right. I want to say thanks once again to all of you and to our panelists.